Welcome aboard. Today is Halloween, my favorite holiday in my favorite time of the year. So let's say we plunder some build systems the old-fashioned way with cannons. Each of these three examples showcases a different aspect of video game cannons that I find fun. And my focus here is on the feel of firing cannons, so I'm just going to give you an overview of what each build is, but yeah, we'll get into that a little too, of course. Starting with, well, opening fire. This is that initial volley where you line up those broadside guns, or, well, a single frontal gun in this case, come up against the other vessel, and then everything goes off all at once. You wait for the critical moment and line up a shot, and ooh, that sense of release is beautiful. There's a couple parts to this sort of aesthetic of cannon combat. I feel like it implies dueling a little bit, like the two ships are sort of flanking each other and finding a good moment to fire. So boss fights, Nova Drift certainly has good types of boss fights or mini boss fights for that. And I think there's also this aspect to the sort of opening barrage of cannon fire, where you want to see what's left and sort of pick up the pieces. When the dust settles, you see what's still alive. This is a Nova Drift build, mostly using missile volley, probably the least cannon-like of the examples I'll show you during this video. But the idea with using missile volley is that it fits really well with the idea of holding your fire and then firing at a key moment, mostly because of charge shields, which is here. The idea is that since you have to charge up your missiles, wait for them to load in, that's a lot like how you're lining up your shot and cannons can take a while to load. And then in Nova Drift, a relatively faster-paced game, this is made into an actually sensible build option by using a shield with charged shields. You gotta wait for the missiles to stock up anyway, between firing volleys. You can see those missiles stocking up in the center bottom of the screen, so you gotta wait and store those up anyway. And that fits the flavor of firing a cannon, but also synergizes with effects that want you to charge up your weapon, therefore you're not firing it. If you use charged shields, then you get a benefit for not firing your weapon, which you already have to do to use the missile volley. What you'll notice is that a lot of this build, besides those missile volley main cannons, is finding ways to attack enemies when they're not active. Between loading, you need something to do to attack enemies in this fast-paced game with swarms of enemies. That's certainly a theme we're going to come back to a lot in this video. Basically, my solution is to use drones, but specifically I'm using charged shields with a mod that allows my shield to be given to my drones, shielded constructs, with an offensive shield. And then the idea is that while I'm throwing out my missile volley, my little fleet of minions can go attack, and they have a robust offensive asset, that shielded construct's boosted shield. And then I'm also, of course, using assault drones, which can sort of form this little laser cannon formation. You saw that in the footage. Charged shields and shielded constructs first. So you can see all my little constructs that have shields, those damaging orbs that are fluttering around them. When the shield takes damage, those expand and deal more damage to enemies they hit. And because drones give you a few different formations, I can kind of wrap the drones around me like bubble wrap, put them onto my nose where they have that formation where they attack enemies, or set them loose and just have them attack enemies at will. I think it's a nice fit for this build. You need to charge up your shields anyway, and while you're unsafe, you don't have your weapon, you can either have your drones defend you or you can send them out to attack stuff. Of course, having a lot of drones also means that damaging shield that I'm charging up with charged shields is duplicated for each construct I have, so I just have a lot of them. That's satisfying too. And then the assault formation. The assault drones already have this nice option where you can just let them loose and attack enemies, but here you can see that I'm able to damage an enemy from far away, against which my missile barrage wouldn't be that effective, because I have the option to stick my drones to the nose of my ship, and they fire these little laser volleys. It basically gives me a weapon when my missile volley isn't ready. And of course, with this option where I have the broadside missile volley, you saw it was actually kind of hard for me to hit that single anyway with most of my missiles. So I found this one pretty satisfying. You get kind of some of the feeling of having a large-scale battle. You're sort of managing a fleet as well. So you fire your guns, and then you have all the little drones to sick on enemies for that kind of prepare to board, that kind of energy. Yeah, I think this is fun, and I like how there are kind of two modes of play. You kill stuff with the charged shield effect, and then you fire off your huge missile volley when everything is lined up just right. Now, you'll have noticed in this footage that I was a little bit torn between which ship to use. You've been seeing a lot of this broadside guns ship, though a lot of the missile volleys have missed enemies as a result. And then for a while I was messing around with using this ship. It's a carrier ship and it summons those small little drones. Now every so often they become basic constructs and therefore they would get my shield if I used charged shields and shielded constructs. So you would get more of that feeling of kind of sicking a fleet on enemies, but it ultimately didn't feel as much like a pirate ship, you know what I mean? Having the guns be on the side, I feel like is a really important part of the aesthetic. Maybe the least canon-like part of this build, though, for me anyway, is the lack of a single high impact projectile. So next up is, maybe rather obviously, going to be an extremely high impact single projectile. So you know what it is, it was at the top of the video, it's the Zarr in Warframe. This is a cannon weapon and it fires little cluster bomblets after it explodes. As you can see, there's kind of several explosions going off, but besides that, it's literally just the cannon. I mean, it's a cannon. This is just a straightforward, satisfying cannon. And you can bring a parrot to refill your ammo. Too obvious? I say not obvious enough. Of course, Carrier has this mod, which allows you to convert ammo to the ammo that your active weapon needs. Normally, I would just swap weapons, but the goal of this build is to fire the Zarr a lot, so in this case I'm going to use ammo case. I hardly ever use Carrier, but this is the exact use case I want ammo case for. Where that last build was an abstract interpretation of cannon fire, this may seem almost too literal. It's literally the most obvious cannon, but I am interested in how the idea of a cannon has been adapted to Warframe here. This is not a slow game, where single occasional cannon shots would make sense on the surface. And at the same time, too, it's not like there are no weapons in Warframe which make a bigger single explosion. So if a cannon is sort of the ultimate weapon, which I don't think that is necessarily the design space of a cannon, that really isn't what this is. There are weapons in Warframe with higher individual impact. So it has to embrace a sort of cannon-like design, you know, not being the biggest gun, even if in ship combat it maybe is often the biggest gun. You can see, looking at the weapon's stats, that there are some things they did to make it feel a little more weighty without preventing you from firing, you know, relatively quickly at a speed that is practical in Warframe. For example, it has a relatively small magazine and a pretty long reload. This weapon reloads one ammo at a time as well, so you're stuffing the cannonballs manually back inside of the cannon. That helps it feel a little more weighty without impacting the fire rate part. You know, while you're shooting it, it can feel really fast, but it adds a sense of weight when you are not firing it or without, you know, jeopardizing that as much. Although, I would personally recommend using a fractalized reset here with your Zarr. This is on ability cast, you gain a gigantic reload speed buff for a little while. I'd interest you in using Tempest the Barrage to reload your cannon faster. I heard you like cannons, so now you can cannon while you cannon, so you can cannon faster. Okay, but the other thing I want to talk about is how the big kind of slow impact flavor of a cannon has been adapted to this kind of fast-paced game using those cluster explosions. I mean, in the first place, Hydroid himself, not even entirely pirate-themed, we have a kind of water-themed Warframe, and he more creates the feeling of a battlefield where a cannon barrage is occurring. Like, look at that. That's not exactly the same as, you know, firing a cannon. But the Zarr's firing, you see, it is a big explosion, sure, but it feels like it has an aftermath. There's that sort of chaos that comes from a combat on a ship, things getting blown to pieces, you know, splinters of wood flying through the air. The explosion has so many particles. Warframe obviously just goes crazy with particle effects generally, so it's a strong choice for this type of game, but seeing all the shrapnel and enemies just get blown to bits, ooh, it's so good. I think those cluster explosions do a good job of adding both impact to the weapon. You know, it really looks like you just murder a person. And you also get, you know, more status chance. A single attack, which might have a lower status output, that all-important way to increase damage. Well, you get more status from mini cluster explosions. It's not a bad piece of design. I think that's clever. And yeah, in the first place, I would argue that a lot of the aesthetic of pirate combat is about a sense of chaos. So somewhat random cluster explosions, I just think it's a great fit. So yeah, while the Zarr with Hydroid and the parrot skin for Carrier might be a little obvious as options for cannon-based builds go, might be a bit straightforward, I do think it feels pretty good. And you gotta include a benchmark that's straight up a pirate with a cannon in here. How you gonna do a video about it? Anyway, now for the heart of cannon combat, which is, of course, firing at will. This is maybe a bit of a weirder one. These are Fortress Defenders in Arknights. This is a pretty weird archetype, generally, but there's a lot to like here, a lot of good cannonness. First of all, what they do, you can see Horn there is firing those shells at that enemy from quite a distance away. And I'm going to talk about their range now, but you'll be able to see that sort of lobbed projectile arc. These guys have minimum range. I think that's a very important, fun aspect of a cannon. Okay, the minimum range. You can see down here, she has very long range, but there's a sort of a couple of tiles in between melee range and her ranged attack range where she cannot shoot. There are very few units in Arknights that have this type of thing, and it can be tricky because the entire idea is that you're defending a point. It's tower defense. And so having a little gap in the middle where if enemies get through that line of fire, well, they can't attack. You have other units, sure, but it's definitely not an advantage. It's an interesting way to make it so you can fire cannons repeatedly, you know, like these other games we've been talking about. Arknights is a game where it would be pretty bad, it wouldn't be good often, to have a weapon that you could only fire very rarely. So how do we make a weapon feel like a cannon, but you can still fire it frequently? Minimum range, and you get that lob feeling of firing a cannonball. Awesome. Just to speedrun the other aspects of this archetype, generally they're pretty durable, they have pretty high attack, which is pretty good in Arknights. Enemies' defense mitigates a flat amount of damage, so single high damage hits are really strong in Arknights. Armor isn't a damage reduction percentage, it's flat damage reduction, so big destruction from the cannon effect. A lot of the cannon units have a secondary effect, which I think is a cool piece of flavor. So Horn's skill 1 here, we'll get back to this, but after you fire it, you get a little area that reveals invisibility. The fire whistle skill that I'm going to show you in a few minutes, well, it creates burning ground, you know, it creates fire. Secondary effects kind of feeds into that idea that cannons are about kind of wanton destruction, chaos, collateral damage, splinters of wood falling from the rafters, things catching on fire. Again, awesome. In Arknights, this archetype is tactically useful for a few different things. One example is having an effectively ranged attacker that still has high block count to also catch enemies from other directions. So in this case, you can see that Fire Whistle is firing upon the position that one of my defenders is blocking, but if an enemy were to get through the other direction, she would be able to block that. Fortress defenders have 3 block. They might not be that great at blocking. Ashlock's skill makes her unable to block, but they do have the ability to block a lot in a pinch, so they kind of hold the line, and creating a highly defensive position where other ranged units are nested behind fortress defenders so that in the dead zone where they can't attack, you know, they have that minimum range, they lob their projectiles, there are other attackers in your squad that can hit in that range. Here you can see I have a bunch of archers that are covering that kind of middle range where Horn, Ashlock, and Fire Whistle can't attack. Yeah, that's cool, but none of that is about cannons necessarily. Look, a bit like the Tempest Barrage situation from Warframe, this is kind of more creating the feeling of a battlefield where cannoning is taking place rather than a single cannon. You get more of that fire at will feeling, lots of chaos going off at different times. That's great and all, maybe doesn't feel exactly like firing a single cannon, cannons singular, but I am not complaining. Well, of course I am, but not about everything. Let's do a comparative review. Ashlock. This is who you saw firing rapidly. Ashlock's big claim to fame is that once you've fully leveled up this skill 2, she can fire very, very quick cycle time bursts of rapid fire shots. So she's got kind of a burst damage skill, but it doesn't have very long downtime. She doesn't block while doing so, and firing rapidly is kind of the exact opposite of what I feel like a cannon is. So although this is the character among the 3 that literally uses something called a cannon lance in the lore, I actually think this is probably the lowest scoring cannonness of the fortress defenders. I would say this is maybe a 1 out of 5. You know, should have wasted less ammo. Fire Whistle. Well, I like the fire. The collateral damage thing is satisfying. Having a burst skill like this that has a longer cooldown, a more traditional burst versus sustained damage trade-off, is pretty nice. She does have a sustained skill, but it doesn't create the fire on the ground, which I really want. And I kind of like that the 3 fortress defenders we have currently, well, they have different cycle times. The way I'm using Horn anyway, you'll see. But obviously the biggest problem with Fire Whistle here is that this is way too safe. Look, she's got a blast shield to defend herself from the napalm. 2 out of 5. Should have had more napalm. Horn. Now we're talking. Okay, she kind of only looks a little piratey. It's like a very well-armed, modern pirate. There's not that much that's nautical about this unit, but that's where the piratiness, lack of piratiness ends. You've got the secondary effects. You've got the cannons being dangerous because these abilities self-damage her. You've got the burst versus sustain trade-off that I like. That's not about cannons. Look, it's a little unfair because I criticized Ashlock for having high fire rate, which is what two of Horn's skills kind of do, but this is the one that I like. I like that this is a sustained damage skill among the other Fortress Defenders, which are kind of more bursty, you've seen, or the skills I like anyway. And Flare Grenade, okay, this is getting a little bit into it, but Flare Grenade has a really nice trade-off, a forbidden combination. It's a power attack type skill. You trade burst damage from her other skills for consistency, but then it has charges, only 2 charges, but this means that if she doesn't attack for a little while, then, well, you're going to store charges, and then you kind of get back that burst damage as well. Additionally, I was explaining before how high single-hit attack is really good in Arknights, so it's nice to be able to get past defenses because you hit for such a large individual number that removing a flat amount from it, from the enemy's defense, it just isn't a very big deal. This is a very good way to deal with armor as well. And the other Fortress Defender skills that I like are not sustain-focused skills, they're more burst options. So you get even more of the feeling of chaos. What you've been seeing throughout a lot of this footage is that I'm using crowd control characters to help keep enemies in range of Ashlock, Horn, and Fire Whistle, rather than blocking a unit. I do sometimes do that, you saw a clip where I was doing that, but here you can see me using Texas the Omertosa and Ethan to just lock the enemies down in Ashlock and Fire Whistle's attack range, so they just can't move there while no one is really in range. Another nice aspect of cannons, right? They're super long range. You definitely get that out of these. Anyway, I think a lot of fun. I'm excited for more Fortress Defenders in the future. As you can tell, I could talk about this archetype for a lot longer. But that's the video, folks. Modernized though we may be, we are privateers here on this channel. And I don't usually do single builds on this channel. That's what the bootleg builds channel's for. But I thought it was nice to do one of these, and I think we should do it every year. This is a fun way to show theme builds, which is an aspect of making builds that I don't talk about as much. It's not as objective, but this isn't a bad way to just share my tastes. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you had fun. My glorious Fortress Defender squad, to you, happy Halloween, folks. And of course, all that's left is to see where we're off to next.